The popular saying goes that there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. But rarely are there weeks where the leading superpower of the day willingly and intentionally dynamites the international security architecture that it has spent decades building. And yet here we are. A little over a month into Donald Trump's second term as president, and the certainties of the post-World War II order a little more than smoking ruins. And the strange part is that the ones suffering the most are Uncle Sam's closest allies. From North America to Europe to the Middle East and Asia, friendships with Washington aren't just strained, they're breaking apart. Nations that have looked up to the US as a moral force for generations are scrambling to reorientate everything from their supply chains to their defense plans to their entire economies. At the same time, countries that have undermined the US-led order are being rewarded with bilateral meetings and the prospect of trade deals. As recently as 2019, Russia was paying Islamic militants bounties for every American soldier they killed in Afghanistan. Now the Kremlin is being offered potential business opportunities. To call it head-spinning would be to severely underestimate just how quickly America's reputation has pivoted. Speaking of the Asian perspective, Singaporean Defense Minister Ng Eng Hen recently declared that the image of America, quote, has changed from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent. And the question that needs to be asked is why? Why would the nation at the head of a vastly powerful network of alliances suddenly turn on its own friends, especially when Washington seems to be gearing up for a war with China, a war that will require America to have as many nations on side as possible? To show what we mean, let's quickly look at a few cases from around the world, cases that will hopefully demonstrate that the new administration isn't just attacking free riders, but even nations that have been pro-America to a fault. The obvious starting point, for me at least, is Europe. In Trump's first term, the critique of Europe was that it was nothing more than a bunch of freeloaders eating croissants and enjoying free healthcare while the United States shouldered the entire military burden of protecting the continent. As long-term watchers will know, it's a critique that still rings true in important ways. We put out a video last year shaming the country, spending too little on defense, a list that includes places like Belgium, Spain, and Germany. Yet, in other ways, this critique is badly out of date. Poland, for example, spends nearly 5% of its GDP on defense, way above the roughly 3.4% that America spends. Lithuania will hit between 5.5% and 6% next year. And these are just two examples. We could give you similarly impressive figures for others like Estonia or Finland or Latvia. Generally, the rule is the closer the country is to Russia, the higher its defense spending. But even further away, you've still got strong performers. My native country of Britain constantly spends above the 2% NATO threshold and is about to announce a large increase. Nor is America carrying the bag for arming Ukraine. The Kiel Institute tracker puts military aid at Kiev at about equal between the US and Europe, with the EU sending more in financial and humanitarian aid. As a percentage of their GDP, 11 nations, topped by Estonia and Denmark, contribute more to Ukraine than Washington does. All of which is why it's been so disorientating to sit here in Europe and listen as we get castigated for not doing our bit. Look, we're a channel that strongly supports our continent upping its defense game, and we have videos in our archive that prove that. But the current administration's approach, it seems stuck in the past. Sadly, that approach has already had dire consequences. This was written on February the 19th, so it's possible there's been even worse news in the days between recording this and you seeing it, but just so far, the refusal to even allow a European presence, let alone a Ukrainian one at peace talks between the US and Russia in Saudi Arabia, has been a slap in the face, combined with the threat of tariffs and talk about annexing Greenland, and it's almost as if the White House's current goal is to turn Europe against America as quickly and efficiently as possible. To be clear, the idea that Washington may want to end its support for Ukraine isn't unreasonable. As Marco Rubio has noted, China is, quote, the biggest threat. And key kits, like air defense missiles that are currently being used in Eastern Europe, could be better deployed in the Indo-Pacific. Nor is it wrong of Washington to push Europe to do more for its own security. But the way this saga has played out so far is troubling, to say the least. As the Telegraph has noted, the administration's demand for $500 billion in minerals from Ukraine as a form of repayment, quote, would amount to a higher share of Ukrainian GDP than the reparations imposed on Germany at the Versailles Treaty. That's the one that ended World War I. Meanwhile, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz has said that Europe will have to provide the security guarantees for Ukraine following any ceasefire. A ceasefire the White House is trying to now impose on Europe without giving it a seat at the table. At the time of writing, it's hard to tell if the continent will push back on this. We've been so dependent on America for so long that our leaders still reflexively believe the US will always come rushing to save us. But we should point out that this behavior could have consequences. While the American narrative is that Europe is weak and irrelevant, the truth is that the EU, even excluding the UK, has an economy larger than China. The euro is the only non-dollar currency with any serious international clout. Vital firms for the semiconductor industry, such as ASML in the Netherlands, are based here, as are world-beating defense companies like Rheinmetall and Saab AB. Until now, all of this latent power has been ignored. But if America turns actively hostile to Europe, then the continent may have no choice but to become the geopolitical behemoth that it by rights should be. And that might mean a Europe that sometimes works against American interests, maybe by trading more with China or just refusing to back Washington in disputes. Honestly, we'd rather our two continents remain partners, but when your closest ally suddenly seems intent on kicking you to the ground, it may be the only way. Nor is it just Europe making this calculation. In the Middle East, the Trump team also seems set on punishing those countries that have been America's biggest supporters. And nowhere does this likely hurt more than in Jordan. A long-standing US ally, Jordan's government has backed Washington even at times when it has been controversial among its own citizens, such as when the kingdom helped shoot down a barrage of Iranian missiles aimed at Israel. In return, Jordan, like its neighbor Egypt, has received vast sums in American aid valued at $1.45 billion per year. While some of that is military aid, much of it has been used to keep the economy afloat and government ministries running, as Al Jazeera explains, quoting, "This funding is a major part of making Egypt and Jordan's economies function." So, when nearly $800 million was cut from US aid funding for Jordan, it left the country reeling. Already tens of thousands of jobs have been lost. Vital things like education and water security have been called into question. And if that wasn't enough, the US administration has also demanded that Jordan and Egypt both host millions of Palestinians who could be displaced from Gaza under Trump's plan to completely depopulate the Strip and build a Riviera. Such a proposal is dead on arrival in both Amman and Cairo, whose populations are broadly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. But both are screwed if Trump really pushes ahead and they refuse, since they're both so dependent on American aid. Egypt alone last year received around $1.3 billion in US military support. As with Europe, this gives America huge leverage over the two countries. But it also means that both are now super incentivized to go looking for partners elsewhere, and you could probably assume an Egypt and Jordan that are bailed out by China or one of the Gulf states are not going to be following America's lead on Middle East priorities like Israel. Beyond Cairo and Amman, the Gaza depopulation plan has also shattered ties with US allies that aren't reliant on Washington's largesse. UAE and Saudi Arabia, to name just two, cannot support any plan that ethnically cleanses Gazans without causing a popular uprising at home. This is what we mean when we say that the US is approaching these problems in a self-destructive way. There are ways to reduce aid spending on countries like Jordan that involve giving them advance notice and turning off the taps gradually. And there are ways to keep Gulf allies on side, even while backing Israel in its war in Gaza. Instead, Trump's moves seem perfectly calculated to give friendly governments no choice but to either fight back or start panicking. And we've not even touched on the most obvious attack on close allies so far, the very near imposition of huge tariffs on Mexico and Canada. Tariffs that in Canada's case have come with a side portion of rhetoric about annexing the country and making it the 51st state. Of course, there are plenty who say that Trump's threats are just bluster, that we're foolish for taking it seriously, and this 51st state stuff is just trolling America's northern neighbor. But since when did trolling become a normal way to treat a close ally? And what possible benefit could outweigh the costs of making one of America's oldest friends suddenly rather wary of it? As the president of the Angus Reid Institute in Canada told Al Jazeera, the mood in Canada right now is one of anxiety and apprehension on one hand and defiance and anger on the other. For many, the feeling is that Canada did not pick this fight, but if they're going to take a punch, they'll try to give one right back. And the worst part? We should probably expect more of this stuff in the months to come. While Trump's team are so far talking a lot about countering China and how their allies in the Indo-Pacific need not worry, the president himself has a less than stellar record in this regard. On the campaign trail, Trump accused Taiwan of stealing America's chip business and said that the island should pay the US a lot more for protection. In October, he called South Korea a money machine and said it would be paying America $10 billion a year if he were president. And Seoul still remembers his first term when the president offered to halt joint US-South Korean military drills as a sweetener to Kim Jong-un, with the North Koreans promising nothing. in return. The result of all of this is that even allies currently favored by the US, like Japan, are hearing a resounding message. Do not rely on us. We cannot be trusted. Rely on us, and we could pull the rug from under you at any moment. And it's here that we get to what are perhaps the furthest reaching implications of all. Right now, America is supposed to be in a new Cold War with China, one which may graduate to a hot war that will likely be the biggest seen anywhere on Earth since World War II. In such a scenario, the United States will need all the friends it can muster, allies who are willing to send their own sons to die for US interests, as Britain did in the Iraq War, or to use their economic leverage to punish Beijing. To maximize its chances of success, Washington will need a globe-spanning coalition that's willing to face everything from economic coercion to missiles to keep the US-led order intact. Yet, instead of forging partnerships, the US, under Trump, is tearing them down, browbeating old friends, attacking neighbors, and insulting allies in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. And for what? What could possibly be worth dynamiting decades, even centuries, of goodwill? So far, America's allies are still hoping for a return to sense, happier to act cowed before Trump than to contemplate a world in which Washington becomes an enemy. But make no mistake, all the countries mentioned in this segment have their limits. All of them are fast learning the lesson that they need to either become great powers themselves or leap into bed with any alternative superpower out there. And those sorts of lessons cannot be unlearned for generations. For a small subset of Americans, things may feel good now. It may feel like the White House is taking control on the world stage. But the world will eventually kick back if it's pushed hard enough, and that could have massively negative consequences for US foreign policy for decades to come. And now we turn our attention to South Korea, because in the last several years, South Korea has reaped the benefits of a transformation. Wind the clock back a decade, and the nation's modest arms industry was barely relevant on the world stage, but today South Korea has become one of the top 10 defense exporters on Earth, beating out exporters like Sweden, Brazil, Japan, Turkey, and more. Combining its immense manufacturing capabilities and its cutting-edge capacity for research and design, the nation has made itself a major player, with zero intent to settle for 10th place. But right now, South Korea's defense industry has a problem, one that risks turning the world's hottest new arms dealer into a has-been that never reached its full potential. To understand the problem, we've got to start with one Yoon Suk-yeol, age 64, hailing from the city of Seoul. For a little under 3 years now, Yoon has been South Korea's president, and in that time, he has made South Korea's defense industry into a crown jewel for the national economy. Yoon claimed credit for a landmark arms deal with Poland in 2022, the country's biggest ever, that saw the equivalent of $13.7 billion invested in a procurement deal for over 1,600 tanks and howitzers, plus almost 50 fighter jets. Since then, Yoon has pushed for as much expansion as possible in the South Korean defense industry, starting up a number of national programs and policies to that effect, and setting an ambitious goal to become a top 4 global arms exporter by 2027, entering a group that today consists of the United States, France, Russia, and China in that order. As Yoon asked of his nation, Yoon received, and in 2024, South Korea rode a wave of global defense spending to exceed the equivalent of $20 billion for that year. Although South Korea has yet to produce something as advanced as a next-generation fighter jet or as voluminous as Russia's annual artillery shell production, it's earned acclaim for its high volume of affordable kit with high quality relative to its cost. For the defense world, South Korea has been a very pleasant surprise, and for Yoon, the country's arms industry has been a crowning achievement. The problem, however, is that Yoon Suk-yeol is currently impeached and has had his powers suspended. He's been incarcerated in Seoul while awaiting trial on charges of leading an insurrection for which he risks either life imprisonment or even the death penalty. For anybody that somehow missed it, Yoon attempted a self-coup in late 2024, invoking martial law and trying to take full control over the country. On the broad spectrum of authoritarian power grabs, it was really a pretty embarrassing affair for all involved, and it was ultimately resolved really quickly. We've covered the coup attempt in detail on this channel with multiple episodes if you'd like to learn more about it, but what we haven't covered yet are the implications for South Korea's arms industry. Now, at the time of writing, Yoon Suk-yeol's fate is as yet unknown, but if he's removed from office or chooses to resign, South Korea will head to a snap election within 60 days of his ouster. Most recent public polling shows members of Yoon's political party, known as the People Power Party, losing by double-digit margins to the presumptive presumptive nominee from South Korea's other major political group, the Democratic Party. That presumptive nominee, Lee Jae-myung, would become the new leader of a rapidly polarizing nation and would face major pressure to distance his new government from Yoon-era policies moving forward. Indeed, the immediate backlash to Yoon's martial law declaration was felt across the South Korean defense industry. In the days following the coup attempt, leaders from Kyrgyzstan and Sweden both cancelled plans to visit the nation, while Poland, still waiting on the export of 800 South Korean main battle tanks, opted to take a wait-and-see approach rather than pushing forward with their deal. International travel advisories against trips to South Korea did not help the situation, and nor did the long standoff that preceded Yoon's eventual arrest. Not even America's then Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin kept his prior plans to visit. But as the crisis evolved, Lee Jae-myung made it clear that regardless of his other disagreements with Yoon Suk-yeol, he and his political allies would support South Korea's new defense export industry for the long term. In fact, Lee has responded to Yoon's impeachment and the growing prospect of his own snap presidential run with a shift in focus toward national security and even embracing what the outlet Korea Pro described as, quote, traditionally conservative defense policies, including a push to grant independence to the Marine Corps. Lee has been embracing something he calls black cat, white cat theory, that, in his telling, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it manages to catch mice. The meaning of that metaphor is that it doesn't matter where a good idea or policy comes from as long as it benefits South Korea, and it's becoming increasingly clear that South Korea's push on defense is one of the areas where Lee feels his black cat, white cat theory should apply. Lee has vowed to increase the number of importer nations for South Korean arms, expand so-called defense diplomacy, and position his political party to, quote, actively support and foster K-defense for national interests. K-defense is what much of South Korea calls its new push toward arms manufacturing, just as Korean pop music, for example, is shortened to K-pop. Lee has shifted the public discourse toward research and development in particular, and has framed the country's martial law crisis as an opportunity. Said Lee on social media in early February, quoting, "Now the world is paying attention. The opportunity has come. Our defense industry is the most visible future food for our country. In addition, it is a means of protecting global security and our national dignity that enables us to increase our deterrence against war around the world." In short, the message is that the South Korean arms industry is going nowhere, and that message has come just in time. At a moment of rapid geopolitical shifts across the world, South Korea is better primed to capitalize on increased demands than nearly any other nation. The country is currently exporting everything from main battle tanks and self-propelled artillery to its popular Golden Eagle training and combat jet to submarines and combat-ready surface vessels. South Korea is hard at work on unmanned tanks and other ground vehicles, military transport aircraft, and a highly advanced multi-role fighter aircraft, the Boramai, all of which it hopes to turn into major export products in the future. And the list of potential customers is rising fast. Some of those customers have already done business with South Korea, but are looking to rapidly step up procurement in the face of rising threats abroad. Those include Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and others. Elsewhere, several nations that are trying to grow into regional military powerhouses have taken a distinct interest in South Korean kit. Poland, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and to some extent Australia. Some of those nations, like Poland and fellow NATO member Turkey, are interested in putting their own manufacturing capacity to work on South Korean designs, including Turkey's Altay main battle tank, an upgrade of the South Korean K2 tank. The Altay is expected to enter service this year. Still other nations, however, are scoping out the global arms industry in a serious way for the first time in a generation or more. Many of those nations are part of the NATO alliance, working to meet the alliance's long-neglected spending minimum expectations and perhaps even surpass those expectations as Europe's situation evolves. Many of the alliance's smaller members, long reliant on the expectation of defense from the United States, are now in a position to try and make rapid acquisitions of kit as the US pivots away from the European theater and presses Europe to manage its own defense. For nations that need to pick up as much high-quality equipment as possible as fast as possible, it's difficult to compete with what South Korea can offer. The nation beats out exporters like the US and France on price while offering many of the same or only somewhat downgraded capabilities. Alliance members shopping on a budget can get more for their euro from South Korea than from most of its export rivals, and they know they'll be working with a nation that's got a proven capability to make large amounts of reliable equipment as fast as possible. They'll also be following the example of Poland, the NATO nation that's most rapidly pursued militarization in this decade, and the nation that, as Poland's vote of confidence, commands a not insignificant competitive advantage. Another notable candidate is Syria, fresh off the destruction of most of its military kit by Israel and potentially looking to rebuild its military once international sanctions are lifted. Finally, South Korea's quick pivot back into defense production will ensure that it doesn't undercut or is usurped by two fellow arms producers, each looking to step up their game at this very moment. One of those producers is the United States, where, despite the country's long-term status as a defense export powerhouse, Washington is still trying to find ways to send even more weapons abroad. Numerous world nations have begun to explore import of American arms, expecting that this would help them cozy up to the Trump administration and buy them favors that they can cash in at some later time. Meanwhile, India is in the process of shifting its own defense priorities, potentially drawing down some of its efforts to create indigenously designed warfighting equipment in order to step up its reputation as a manufacturer. India doesn't necessarily want to fill the same niche as South Korea, but it appears interested in becoming a manufacturing hub for a range of other nations looking to build weapons of war at more favorable costs. That, of course, could constitute an opportunity for collaboration with South Korea, pushing out even more affordable kit of good quality, but it could also constitute the start of a new rivalry. In any case, South Korea's arms industry appears poised to survive Yoon Suk-yeol's disastrous coup attempt. In a shifting geopolitical landscape, Seoul remains primed to take advantage of a growing hunger for weapons across the globe. Should we all be worried about Tajikistan? Now look, we'd had as a guess that for most of our viewers, Tajikistan is the sort of place that you might think about a couple of times a year. If you're even thinking about it at all. But thanks to a troubling series of reports over the last several months, we now have growing reason to believe that Tajikistan will command more of our attention in the near future. And not for the right reasons. We'll start by zeroing in on the Tajik capital of Dushanbe, where on the 14th of February, over 30 people were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 8 years at the low end to 20 years on the high end. Their crimes were related to an attempted mass poisoning attack in the small city of Adat, where last March the convicted had tried to poison food that was being served at a local festival. According to the Tajik Attorney General, 10 other suspects are still at large. Most troubling of all are the affiliations of the 30-plus convicted attackers, Islamic State Khorasan, better known as ISIS-K. ISIS-K is ostensibly the Afghan offshoot of the Islamic State, but they draw their name from the historical region of Greater Khorasan, including parts of Afghanistan, Iran, and several Central Asian nations, including just about all of Tajikistan. And in particular, Tajikistan has been implicated as a major source of recruits for ISIS-K, so much so that in April 2024, the New York Times published a story with this headline: "An ISIS terror group draws half its recruits from tiny Tajikistan." At the time that this particular story was published, a handful of young Tajik migrants had been implicated in the attack on Crocus City Hall, a music venue in Moscow where a total of 145 people were killed and 551 injured in an attack in late March last year. That attack came within weeks of the mass poisoning attempt in Vardat, and those two attacks weren't the only major ones of the year. In January, 3 Tajik nationals helped to carry out a bombing in Kerman, Iran that killed 105 people and injured nearly 300. One of the Tajiks in question was the mastermind behind the attack. Other major ISIS-K attacks that year included numerous mass casualty incidents, although in the others, the attackers either were not Tajik or, in most of the cases, they ultimately went unidentified. According to the Tajik Interior Minister, there were 3 successful militant attacks in the country during 2024, while the mass poisoning attempt and one other were successfully thwarted. In early 2025, an attempted prison break by 9 Tajik prisoners with allegiances to the Islamic State would see 5 of them killed after they assaulted guards. That attempted breakout also took place in the city of Vardat, where the poisoning attack was attempted. Now, we imagine that the vast majority of people who are watching this, you're not intimately familiar with the situation in Tajikistan, so we'll run you through the basics. Tajikistan is a nation of about 10 million people located in Central Asia. Draw a line from the northernmost point in Kazakhstan to the southernmost point on the Pakistani coast, and that line will intersect Tajikistan at about the midway point. It's a post-Soviet state that's classified as a developing nation, highly mountainous, and on most of its territory, quite remote. About 49 of every 50 people follow Islam, and both Russian and the Tajik language, similar to Farsi, are spoken by most people. The country has never really broken out of that post-Soviet sleepy authoritarian vibe, but it's become increasingly repressive in recent years, at a time when economic circumstances for ordinary citizens have grown pretty dire. Over half the country's working-age men are unemployed, many of them forced to find work abroad, and those who do get stuck in Russia, where they're at the bottom of society, highly isolated, underpaid, and have little means of improving their situation. Poor and getting poorer at home, alone and frustrated in their attempts to support themselves, young Tajik men have become prime recruiting targets for radical Islamic organizations, including jihadist groups like the Islamic State. When ISIS was in its heyday in Iraq and Syria, an estimated 2,000 Tajiks or more left their nation to go and take part, while the organization's more recent pivot toward highly franchised asymmetrical insurgency has created demand for many of those same Tajiks to work as recruiters and cell leaders back home. Online recruitment efforts are reportedly difficult to get away from for young Tajik men, and those who've gone to work in Russia while keeping to small Tajik communities are especially vulnerable. The Crocus City Hall attack in 2024 shone a light on the increased involvement of Tajik extremists within the group, but that attention was fleeting outside Russia and Central Asia, and in the aftermath, ISIS-K used the attack as a prime recruitment opportunity. The attack had been immediately precipitated by a decision in Russia to deport over 17,000 Tajiks, a turn of events that embittered many others and drove them to leave of their own volition, constraining their economic opportunities even further in the process. From a new Tajik language magazine to a media campaign to spotlight the apparent torture of the attack perpetrators and more, ISIS-K made savvy use of their opportunity to connect with more and more young Tajik men, and the effort appears to be working. They've seized on popular discontent with Tajikistan's leader, worked their way into the Tajik diaspora abroad, and established such a presence in some parts of the nation that apparently cells of 40 or more can work together on a mass poisoning attack, only being stopped when catastrophe was already at hand. It's for this mix of reasons that global analysts are now calling attention to Tajikistan. By some accounts, the nation is at risk of becoming a new hotbed for transnational jihadism, and by other accounts, it already is. The country shares a rugged, porous border with Afghanistan, where ISIS-K and other jihadist groups can operate in remote locations with only intermittent interference from the Taliban, and despite investment from China to enhance border security between the two nations, the problem appears to be getting worse. Meanwhile, the Tajik government has proved all but incapable of taking meaningful action. Its state structure has long since started to calcify under the yoke of its president, Emomali Rahman, who's been the dictator there for 33 years now, and is hell-bent on ensuring that his son will assume that role after him. As such, the government is more preoccupied with fighting political opposition and internal critics than dealing with jihadists, who it insists should be blamed exclusively on influences coming from outside of the country. While Tajikistan is known to engage in counter-extremist efforts against Muslims that range from fines for wearing hijabs to random mosque closures to forcible beard shaving and more, those are old and tired tricks. They're halfway decent if you want to deter ordinary people from getting involved in disorganized extremist movements, but they are nowhere near the sort of thing that would lead a group like ISIS-K to lose any influence there. If anything, those tactics will just embitter more people to the Tajik government and send more recruits in ISIS-K's direction. And look, in Central Asia, Tajikistan is not the only country dealing with a rising jihadist problem. But between the country's deep economic malaise, its close proximity to ISIS-K strongholds, and the rising bitterness and discontent felt across the population, the country appears to be the epicenter of a growing transnational security threat. It's important to hold two realities in our minds at once. The vast majority of Tajiks do not present a threat of violent extremism, and also, it ain't a coincidence that when ISIS-K members in Central Asia can be identified, Tajiks typically either make up part of the cell in question or all of it. Right now, it does not appear that the actions of the regional governments, least of all the Tajik dictatorship, are going to be enough to change the situation. Either counter-extremist efforts in Tajikistan get a hell of a lot more competent really, really quickly, or the country may soon gain notoriety for its new and brutally violent export. Thank you for watching.